Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. How you guys doing? I am Jen Stojkovic. I'm the Executive Director of sf.citi. I hope you guys are appreciating this awesome mobile office setup. Thank you so much for joining us today. Come on, keep filing in. 3 minutes in, we're pretty good to start on time. So today we're going to be talking about everybody's favorite San Francisco topic, housing. What is going on with San Francisco housing? Is it going to drop? Are we finally going to be able to rent in this city? Is everybody leaving? Will we have an exodus? These are many of the questions on everyone's minds right now, and that is going to be the focus of today's COVID-19 effect conversation. I'm really pleased to be joined by Xiomara Cisneros, our policy director from our good friends at Bay Area Council. We're going to be talking all things housing, what we have in store, and have a really cool conversation today. I've got some quick housekeeping notes to go through with y'all, and then we'll do a quick brief on what the state of housing looks like right now, and then we will bring up our distinguished speaker. So, my housekeeping notes. We have a Q&A, so you should see a Q&A button right there. You can fill out at any time in today's conversation your questions for us. We will do our absolute best to get to as many questions as possible. The quicker you can fill them out and the earlier we can get the queue going, the earlier on in today's conversation, we will be able to switch to a Q&A conversation. Also, I just want to add that we are not experts in all things housing. This is a huge topic, so we're going to cover as much as we can with today's expertise. We are going to be recording today's webinar, so if you missed some sort of really compelling housing nugget today, don't worry. We're going to email it out to you afterwards, and then you can replay it and share it with all of your friends and family to talk about the future of Bay Area housing. That brings me to my last point before we get into our deck. If you want to share your thoughts on today's conversation, you can. You're going to use the hashtag the COVID-19 effect. You'll see Jackie just shared it there in the chat. So please feel free to tag us, chime in on what you're thinking about, chime in on where you think you're going to go, where your company is going to go in the future. We look forward to hearing it. Without further ado, I am going to bring up our quick briefer on all things housing and how we got to today. Sound good, everybody? Let's do it. All right. San Francisco's housing and rental market. So first off, who is SF.citi? I got to do this. So we are San Francisco's Tech Trade Association. We were founded back in 2012 to represent San Francisco's tech community, to have a voice in tech policy decisions and collaborate with government leaders. Housing happens to be one of those issues where we are doing quite a bit of conversations representing all the tech companies in town. Housing is one of the top issue areas for most of the companies. We also wanted to quickly let you know that we have a COVID-19 update that we send out every Monday morning. So if you'd like to learn more about the tech COVID-19 update, you can go to sf.citi.org. We provide updates and resources from the San Francisco tech community, from the city of San Francisco, from the state of California, and the many, many things going on with our nonprofit community. All right, let's get to it. TLDR, COVID-19 and SF housing. So it's no surprise, this pandemic has sent a total shockwave through the most expensive housing and rental market in America. We don't know yet what's to come, but we know that this effect is going to last for many, many years. Throughout the years, pundits and headlines have warned San Francisco is facing an imminent mass migration. Everybody's been saying it. Everybody loves the San Francisco takedown story, but it never quite came. That is until now. With record levels in unemployment and a stalled economy, residents started to weigh the costs of staying in San Francisco. Many have decided to move back home with their parents or relocate to a less expensive city. Zillow reported that some 2.7 million adults across the country moved back in with their parents in March and April. Almost 3 million people. Wow. I'd be curious to know how they're doing come July. Employees who are able to work remotely also began to question whether San Francisco made sense for them. Major tech companies such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Slack announced plans to allow remote work even after the pandemic ends. And in an anonymous survey conducted by Blind, they found that nearly 2/3 of respondents would consider leaving the Bay Area, and 20% said they'd be willing to take a pay cut to permanently work remotely elsewhere. While San Francisco tenants have mostly been able to pay their rent thus far, about 94.5% paid their rent in full in June, those strong numbers might be short-lived. Real estate leaders attribute June's promising showing to the stimulus checks, the $600 top-up that everybody's getting, and tenants prioritizing rent payments. With the enhanced federal unemployment benefits set to expire at the end of this month, and federal legislators looking nowhere close to a deal on the second stimulus, the extra supply of cash that some tenants have relied on looks like it might be drying up. Couple the cash flow issues with the bans on evictions set to expire, and the country could face an unprecedented eviction crisis. Then, for the tenants leaving San Francisco, they're running into a lack of subletters. Normally in San Francisco, finding a subletter takes a few weeks at most. But now, as the main supply of subletters, of course, are college students and interns. It's completely disappeared. Tenants that want to move have no choice but to break their lease. And unsurprisingly, a survey from SF Apartment Association found that 1 in 13 renters broke their lease over the last 3 months. It does appear the pandemic has put SF rent prices in free fall. In May, the median rental price for a 1-bedroom apartment in San Francisco dropped by a shocking 9.2% year over year. Unheard of numbers, but the slide did not stop there. Rent prices in June plunged a record-setting 11.8%. That's almost 12% in the most expensive place to rent in North America. This could be the start of a welcome trend. With the combination of remote work and extensive unemployment, this pandemic pricing, as it's being called, should continue to place significant downward pressure on rents across the Bay Area. It appears that tenants have gained the balance of power in the current rental market. This has led to landlords rushing to fill the mounting vacancies by offering crazy incentives. Seriously, guys, this is just totally nuts. There are tenants that are even negotiating new rent rates with their landlords. The housing market, on the other hand, appears to be only slightly affected so far. After an initial decline in listing activity and the median price of a single-family home, the numbers in San Francisco and the Bay Area seem to have rebounded in the past month. San Francisco's housing market in June saw the median house price rise 3%, and the number of listings accepting offers actually increased by 6%. And as urban dwellers flee the city, there is somebody that is benefiting, and that is the Bay Area suburbs. They're seeing record numbers as counties have 20 to 60% more home sale activity from year over year in June. This could be in part due to the fixes made after the 2008 financial crisis to the fundamental problems with the housing market and the shoddy mortgage underwriting. It also helps that most of the job losses occurred in the service and retail industries, where workers in the Bay Area are more likely to be renters than buyers. As the planning begins for the next 8-year cycle, the RHNA's preliminary assessment calls for the creation of 441,000 new housing units in the next decade. That doubles our last housing goal. It's an immense task for a region that has historically had a lot of difficulty adding more housing. My favorite fun fact about housing is that California is actually 49th in production for housing in this country. There is only one state that produces less housing than us. It's Utah. Even as construction has been able to continue during the pandemic with one minor freeze, the major worry now focuses on how the pandemic is going to affect the future. With this much uncertainty surrounding the future, housing productions could reach alarmingly low levels. With similar conditions after the 2008 crash, including low construction and land costs, the state experienced an abrupt and steep decline in new housing. In the 4 years from 2008 to 2012, California permitted 50,000 new homes a year, an anemic amount compared to the 200,000 houses built annually prior to the crash. Wow. In learning from the last recession, state officials have introduced 6 bills as part of their housing package to provide a boost to housing production and making sure this recession does not exacerbate the housing crisis. Despite the pandemic and its effects on the housing and rental market, San Francisco remains the most expensive place to live in America. If San Francisco wants to have a realistic opportunity of meeting its housing requirements, keeping rent low, and holding on to residents, the production of new housing needs to ramp up immediately. Okay, that's a lot of facts, that's a lot of figures. So I think that should do it for our TLDR on housing. If you want to read more, you can go check out our housing blog that we recently published that includes all of those details and many, many more. So before we bring up our guest speaker, I'm going to do a quick poll of the room. Let's see. How has the pandemic affected your housing situation? Take a look at the poll, fill in your results. All right. So far, people haven't moved, surprise. Oh, there we go, moving back with family, let's see it. All right, we will just let that fill in for a second there. And while we are doing that, let's bring up our guest speaker today. All right, Xiomara, let's welcome you to the virtual stage.
Hello.
How's it going?
It's going. Can't complain.
It is going. I feel like that is the most common answer I'm getting lately.
Yeah. Well, I recently, we talked about this before the webinar, but I got tested for COVID-19 and yay, negative. So, just as I suspected, but you just never know. Asymptomatic carriers, what have you. So
Yeah, mine comes back in the next 48 hours or so. So we will see.
yeah.
Okay. All right, let's close out this poll. If you guys want to just put your last vote in. Do you have a prediction of what everyone's saying?
Oh gosh, I feel like haven't moved. It's going to be the top one.
Okay. All right, let's end the poll. And we're sharing results. You are correct. 77% of folks haven't moved. But 1 out of 20 of y'all are living back home with mom and dad. You're part of that 2.7 million.
Yep.
I'm curious to see by September how many people are still surviving with mom and dad.
Exactly.
There's your face. You just go to like a complete look of like sympathy.
It's normal. It's like this now the way to go.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's get to it. So I think the best way to start today's conversation is pre-pandemic. What did San Francisco's housing landscape look like?
Sure. So before we had a public health crisis, we had this housing crisis. And if anything, as we'll talk about later on, it's been exacerbated by COVID-19. As you mentioned, there was a huge jobs to housing imbalance. We already have a housing shortage, and just with all the workers that we hear being the economic engine that we are here in the Bay Area, it's been that much more difficult to build the homes for all the workers that we are inviting here that we're lucky to have. So in the Bay Area since 2010, we've generated over 700,000 jobs, but we only built 65,000 homes for those workers. And as you said, drilling into San Francisco, you show that 8.5 jobs to housing ratio, but is that high? Depending on what years you look at, it's between 8-to-1 to 10-to-1.
Yeah.
And because of this huge housing shortage, it's putting pressure on prices. So as you said, like until very recently, those costs have been escalating over the past few decades. And that's why it's $1.5 million median price for a home in San Francisco and close to $4,000 for a one-bedroom rent. So yeah, it's definitely a huge housing shortage and a big jobs to housing imbalance.
So out of curiosity, one of the things that I always find really fun is comparing San Francisco to similar areas. Are there any other markets that have seen this level of growth that have handled housing differently?
I'd say, San Mateo County, the peninsula, you can't help but think of this area, which is, you would really think about Silicon Valley because that's where like all the tech giants are and the hubs. And, when you think of San Jose, you don't realize actually how relatively suburban it is. It's over 90% zoned for single family homes. And, that's surprising. You don't really think of that when you think of a big city, when the biggest city, San Jose. But yeah, relatively, Silicon Valley and the peninsula is largely low density except for some pockets, and yet they have like the most workers here over there. So I do, if you look at the RENA numbers, a lot of the cities have been doing pretty well in terms of approving homes, but those tend to be market rate, above market homes, and not for the most vulnerable populations, extremely low income. So I do think that there is now more than ever a realization of like, yes, we need to say yes to housing, we need to approve homes for our workers, but it's coming at a late time of the hour.
Yeah, I would say so. So just a reminder to everyone, I see a couple Q&A popping in there, but as we have our conversation today, please throw your questions in there. So what do you think has been the most interesting or surprising trend that you've seen how the pandemic is affecting housing in the city?
Yeah, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but in terms of housing sales, like the past couple months, seen some big hits, but now it's stabilizing, and even some parts of the Bay Area doing really well. And that's, I think that just is a testament to how resilient the housing economy here is in the Bay Area and how affluent we are, because we could afford this recession to an extent. but that's not so much the case of renters. And I'm not really surprised that rents are softening, but to the extent that they are, it's pretty amazing. I mean, historically, we see 1 to 2% change up or down, but as you said, it's 9% the previous month, 11.8%. And if you look at the cities in the Bay Area where they house the big tech giants, Cupertino and Mountain View are over 15%, Menlo Park 13% drop year over year. So it's pretty impressive, drastic, the softening of prices, and a little bit surprising.
Do you think that, so right now, obviously, while we're in the shelter in place protocol, people aren't going to be in those specific areas. Do you think we're going to see like a boom back up in, maybe like June of next year or whenever, fingers crossed, we can actually get back into the office?
I do think, so it's interesting how like some of these big companies like Facebook and Google said, work from home. And that's like, one of the two factors that's happening, right? We have the economic recession where people are being, pushed out, they lost their jobs, and we'll definitely go into that a little bit more of how like the unemployment benefits have been able to help stabilize renters, but people are being pushed out of the Bay Area. But, in terms of, I'm sorry, can you repeat your question? Sorry. I lost my train of thought.
No worries. Do you think it's going to bounce back when the offices reopen?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so I do think that jobs beget jobs. Like there's innovation clusters for a reason, and so I do think that people are being pushed out, obviously, to the suburbs and to the outer regions. But in terms of office. Wanting to be close to each other, jobs wanting to be close to each other, I don't think that's necessarily going to end anytime soon. So maybe, I don't know, these decisions were made a little hastily. I think we're surviving, not thriving. So I do think that us as an innovation hub is going to remain, but it's just like in terms of timing, we don't really know. But in the interim, like we are already seeing some of that short-term impacts of like people moving away. Like they don't have to do those long commutes anymore from the suburbs because they could just plug in online on a Zoom call. So
yeah. And that actually brings me, to a thought of if there is a shortage all across California, which we know, would these suburbs where techies are starting to buy property and move out to, would they then have an issue where they could have a shortage next? That's something we've looked at yet?
Yeah, that's a real, we are going to see price adjustments, and we're already seeing some of that, right? Like some, a lot of folks are moving to Oakland and other parts of the outer region, and costs are increasing. Like there's been a double-digit increase in Oakland, for example. So I do think, there is going to be some adjustment, some rebalancing with that. And Oakland is actually has, they kind of mocked San Francisco. They're like, oh, we built more housing than you. So it's like, we have, like, come to Oakland. So, it's,
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're all going there now. So I do see some movement, some circulation, some adjustment, I guess, if you will.
So do you think that the slide in rent eventually is going to hit a floor?
After the .com boom and bust, when rents went down as much as 25%.
Wow.
So I wouldn't be surprised if, maybe we get to that point, but I do think that there are some safeguards that we have now, and hopefully, cross our fingers, the Congress will push forward the next HEROES Act, the next federal stimulus, because that's really been our saving grace up to this point. We've made some adjustments since the Great Recession to prevent major foreclosures and forbearance, and we have now had the unemployment. We've received our $1,200 check. So all these things have been really helpful. And I think we haven't seen as much of an impact as we would have seen previously. But yeah, I don't really know. That's just like what we've seen in the past. I can't really predict like what we're going to see in terms of housing costs moving forward. I will say that just anecdotally from our members, like the pipeline has been really helpful so far. Like this is, I think, what's stabilized our housing economy as much as it has, because we have, projects lined up. So, maybe for the next year we'll be fine, but looking at 2021, maybe not so much. And one of our general contractor members, I won't name names, but he said that, I could see, the construction industry unemployment going up as high as 50%. So, yeah, and the outlook for market rate housing doesn't look great. It's a little bit different picture for affordable housing. We could talk a little bit more about that later, but yeah, this could be like the canary in the coal mine. We just don't know.
Yeah. So one of the really shocking pieces that came out last week in Bloomberg, which I'm sure many folks have read, is 1 in 4 people in New York have not paid rent since March. And that is just, that's huge. 1 in 4 people, 25% of people. And with the money potentially running out at the end of July, are we kind of looking at that exact same crisis? Do we think that, that $600 is what's been holding all these San Francisco renters up, and once that's gone, we could end up in a New York type situation?
Yeah, potentially, because homeowners are the more affluent population, and they're doing as well as they can in the housing costs because of that. Renters tend to be more cost burdened. They're spending more than 30%, 50% of their paycheck for the roof over their head. In California, statewide, the bottom 25% of income earners send 76% of their paycheck for their rent. So it tends to hurt the most vulnerable populations. There was a survey, I think earlier this month, where I think 31% of renters nationwide said that they don't think that they could pay their next rent because, like exactly as you said, these unemployment benefits are running out. So I think we're going to see that, that 2.7 million number of Gen Z moving back in with their parents, their family members, a lot of doubling up, more overcrowding rates, and sadly pushing the most vulnerable populations, those earning 0 to 30% AMI, extremely low income, being pushed into homelessness. So I do think it's a dire picture moving forward if we don't continue to get the support from the federal government.
So why don't you tell us a little bit more about the difference between kind of what the outlook looks like for market rate housing and affordable housing?
Yeah, so it doesn't look so great right now in terms of market. In terms of new entitlements, the big theme right now is uncertainty. Like, we just don't know. We can't look in our crystal ball and predict what's going to happen in the future. So, I'm glad to see, current construction projects move forward. There was a time during SIP when it was only affordable housing projects, or if they had a certain percentage of inclusionary, that they can move forward. But that's going to dry up at some point, and developers are more risk averse, and it's just really hard to underwrite when you just don't know what the rents are going to look like. And construction costs have softened, but not to the point to really justify the uncertainty of the rental revenue. So just like those two question marks on each side of the equation just makes things that much more precarious, I guess. And affordable housing is, subsidized below market rate housing, capital A, capital H, affordable housing, is looking better, but, they have dedicated sources of funds. We have our affordable housing funds in cities because of impact fees, but even those are contingent on the market in a couple of respects. One, the tax credits, investors aren't really paying as much as they were previously to this economic recession. They're not valued as much because they don't really know what their business is going to look like moving forward. So it's not as valuable, the tax credits. And also just, cities, their budgets are hemorrhaging right now. And so they're, wanting to safeguard their funds a little bit. And we do receive those impact fees from market rate development. So if there's not market rate development happening, then those inclusionary fees, impact fees aren't going to help fund that much needed affordable housing. With that said, I will, San Francisco is in a unique good situation and a lucky situation because just before COVID-19, we passed the $600 million affordable housing bond. And the reason why I say that's so lucky, because it's now there's like this, austerity mindset, like I'm part of a committee for what's called BAFA, the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. They're just a regional entity that we helped support legislation passed last year by Assemblymember Chu, AB 1487, that basically established this new regional authority that could help fund affordable housing. And so as opposed to doing it in silos in 101 different ways, let's all think comprehensively about this problem. And, at the time, earlier this year and late last year, we were looking at a regional affordable housing bond, a $10 million bond, but, leading into COVID-19 with focus groups and pulling our voters, they were just not having it. They were just like, there's like fatigue at this point, just like, how are my tax dollars, my, these public fund dollars translating to transportation improvements, better BART, more affordable homes, less homelessness, So, with that said, we're not having this regional affordable housing bond on the ballot in November. And that's not to say we don't need it. And you would think if now more than ever, it makes sense because the interest rate right now, borrowing for a bond is like extremely low right now, historically low. So you would think, now is the time, but again, like all these factors, it just makes us that much more in a better position in San Francisco having the $600 million bond.
So are there any other local or regional pieces of legislation or things that have been done in other parts of the country or the world that could help address this here?
I'm not, and I don't know in terms of other parts of the world, but in California, there's a couple things going on like statewide that we're looking at. I have to think a little bit about that in terms of other parts of the country. Everyone's trying to shore up their own kind of rent relief, emergency rental assistance type programs. And we have a lot of that here. Not every state, but a lot of states have, their eviction moratoriums. But here in California, I think it's a very elegant situation, and the Bay Area Council hasn't taken a position on it yet, but something that the Democratic senators are proposing is this tax credit program where they will provide the landlord tax credits in amount, and that'll be efficient or valid for the next 10 years. And therefore the renter would owe that debt to the state, and the tenant has like that 10-year period to pay it off, or if they could demonstrate that they financially aren't able to, then it's written off. So that way the debt's not owed to the landlord has their tax credits, and they could cash that in immediately for actually liquid cash. So that seems like a potential win-win. I forgot the name of the bill right now, but that's something that we are looking at closely as a potential creative solution.
Yeah, we had the super about a month ago or so, and he was speaking about that. And I thought it was a really clever bill as well, and that kind of makes me wonder, is there federal credit systems? Like, is there other kind of larger federal government pushes that could mirror that kind of thing to help landlords so that they could forgive part of this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And like what we're seeing right now in terms of like the HEROES Act, like it just passed the House recently, and they actually took out the housing component of this HEROES Act, maybe to make it move through Congress that much more efficiently. Yeah. But what we're seeing is $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, support for homeowners to prevent foreclosure, funding for affordable housing and homelessness housing, so all kinds of things, but nothing as like creative, I think, I haven't seen before as like our tax credit recommendation here in California.
So really quickly for everybody that's on today's webinar, what other pieces are key at the federal level? I mean, obviously you listed a few of the huge things that are included in the HEROES Act. what other significant pieces are moving at a federal level that they should know about, if any?
Yeah, I think the other big one that, and I forgot the name of the bill, but there's basically is not just affordable housing as infrastructure, which absolutely makes sense as a policy issue, but it's just is a major infrastructure bill, and is looking at housing, transportation, resilience, all kinds of different policy efforts in area. And I'll be sure to see if I could, maybe, I don't know, Jacqueline could put it in the chat, but this is something that I think is really key and helpful, again, for addressing the preventing a major eviction and foreclosure crisis.
Well, it just really sounds like, and especially, you're hearing the last few days, Joe Biden said he thinks this is like an FDR moment, and, there's this real push for like the make work, the build stuff, let's start building. And it seems like with an affordable housing crisis in America, that could be an obvious choice.
I absolutely agree. I couldn't agree more. It helps with our workers, the labor side, the construction side, and it's helpful in terms of bringing much needed affordable housing. So I definitely think that is a strategic, smart investment moving forward, and I am hopeful to see some actual investments in that point. So yeah, that major infrastructure bill would really help with that issue. It's definitely a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, after the Great Recession, unfortunately, we were building like 25% of what we could be building, because obviously when the market falls, you get very concerned about building market rate housing and if people are going to buy it. How do we prevent developers from just completely drying up again and just stopping building everything?
Yeah, I mean, that's challenging because we need to give them certainty that we're going to be here to buy the homes. And that is a very challenging, but I don't think that it means that we have to let up on housing production any less. It's part of, can California, this is actually something that we've talked about at the Bay Area Council, is doing like their own economic stimulus bond, because if we can ensure that we're not as hard hit with this recession, to make sure that we do have people available to work and therefore available to buy and rent homes, then that could really help the larger housing economy and economy. So that's something that it's too late to put it on the ballot this year, but we are having discussions in the Capitol, and something that we are taking very seriously, pushing forward.
Okay, just a reminder, I see a bunch of questions piling in. We'll get to those in a minute or two. I think one thing that would be great for the audience to learn about is, on a local level, what are a few policies that people should know about that are really impacting what's going on right now, that they can perhaps get involved in the November election or beyond?
Sure. So let me think. So there's the split roll tax, which is Prop 15, which is schools and community first. That's going to be a big ballot measure in November. And because of Prop 13, a lot of all properties are assessed on their tax value based on the assessed value, not the market value, since 1978. And it goes up every couple percent since then. So this tries to adjust that on the commercial side, not on the residential side. And, full disclosure, the Bay Area Council is opposing that bill. It's important to have a thriving economy, and we value our businesses and all the things that make up the various components of a strong economy. The other one that I could think of, there's just a couple of local measures that I'm really excited about in City of San Mateo and City of Alameda, where we're overturning bans on multifamily development. These have been in place for a really long time. Yes, exactly. It's a form of exclusionary zoning. So how do we open up development so we can invite more multifamily development? It makes the way that they're designed, it makes not only affordable housing developments, which need the density and the height to become feasible, but it also makes smaller missing middle type housing, not single family homes, not super high density developments, but duplexes, smaller multiplexes, these naturally forms of affordable housing feasible. So those are two local ones that I could think of. And then, going back to the state level ones, there is also the rent restriction, what's it called? Rent control, thank you. Rent control coming on the ballot. There was Prop 10 from last year, so it's basically coming back in a slightly different form this November.
And that one is where?
This is a statewide one.
Statewide, okay. All right, well, we've got a queue of questions that are piling up, so let's get to it. All right, let's start with, hi Nick. Let's start with your question. How will the macro effects of housing in San Francisco inform or influence housing markets in other tech hubs like Seattle or New York? Have we seen this before, perhaps, with other recessions or busts and booms?
Yeah, I mean, that's where a lot of folks are moving, more like Seattle. I think maybe less so New York. And a big factor for that is, again, with coronavirus, folks are wanting to move more to the suburbs. We were talking about home sales and how they were doing pretty well, generally speaking, but that's more of like the single family homes and less so like on the condos, right? Because in multifamily development, before pre-COVID, we valued like these, shared spaces. It was neat to have like a pool and like, a shared tennis court or what have you. But now it's really important to have your own, balcony, your own personal open space, what have you. So I don't see perhaps too much movement going to other, unfortunately, because I love cities and I'm an urbanist. So I do see less maybe movement towards bigger, higher density cities, but in terms of like more moving to like the suburbs, because people are looking for and valuing more of that open space. And suburbs in turn are having to think about how they can amenitize these communities. It's an opportunity for the suburbs to think about how they can have more of like that work, live, play type of space.
Yeah. I mean, I received an ad on Facebook, I think it was the other day, for this startup that I'm forgetting the name of, but it was basically take your in-law unit and rent it to a tech person to be an office. Have you heard about this?
Yeah, I mean, that's like so we love ADUs. We're the Barry Council, accessory dwelling units or granny flats, there's all kinds, casitas, you name it, are a really important form of the housing solution. But unfortunately, we don't really have the guardrails to ensure that these homes are being actually used for a home. So, the fact of maybe like renting it out, I don't know, for office, or like it can be used for a gym or what have you. So that, to the extent possible, that we can use for ADUs for a home, especially because with COVID-19, we've seen the outbreaks in nursing home facilities, and people are being that much more thoughtful of how they want their elderly loved ones, their parents, to live in a place where they're not that susceptible to these type of outbreaks. So ADUs are a really creative way to do that.
Well, I'm, at this point we do so many online events. I'm like, okay, I need proper lighting. I'm a little bit dark inside. Like, I need to just get like a webinar, like podcasting room myself. You start considering that in where you look for in a home.
Exactly. And you need more space for that. You need a bigger footprint, bigger yard, so you can do that addition and have that new office space. Right. Exactly.
All right. So many of us former office workers have adapted to distributed flexible telework, and many of our material possessions and office supplies have dematerialized into our portable devices, enabling us work where we live and freeing up office space in downtown SF. Others who don't have that luxury may work in SF but still have to commute from the burbs. How can we turn more office space downtown into housing space and leverage short-term rentals in new ways so that we can all free up the freeways and live and work more nomadically and flexibly? Comms person wrote that. That was very eloquent. Is that possible? Can we make offices condos?
Well, that's actually, I think, a great setup question for me. If I could plug our bill, the Barrie Council is co-sponsoring with California Forward, SB 1385. This is one of the 6 bills that you mentioned in your, the preface presentation that you did. That's been really championed by a handful of Senate Democrats after SB 50 died last legislative session. Pro Tem Tony Atkins said, "Hey, I'm going to put together production no matter what, and I need a team to help me do this." And so that led to these 6 bills, and one of which is SB 1385, which allows housing on land zoned for office, retail, commercial. So we're seeing, I think, more and more of these like dead malls, the like retail strips. And it just makes all the sense in the world, especially when they're close to transportation, when they're close to jobs, to instead convert that and use that for housing. And if that space has been 50% vacant for the past 3 years and it's eligible for SB 35, a really great tool that Senator Scott Wiener passed a couple of years ago as part of the 2017 housing package. And essentially, if a city doesn't meet their RHNA, their Regional Housing Needs Obligation, it's basically the number of homes that they have been determined that they need to build to do their fair share. So if a city hasn't met their RHNA, then the developer has authority to streamline that development through. And there's different criteria and caveats to that, but basically it's a really great tool. It's something that I'm really thinking is going to be extremely helpful as we look at this next RHNA cycle, which we're going through right now. So yeah, to answer your question, yes, absolutely. Let's use these spaces for housing.
Yeah, it's so funny because about a year ago, we were having this conversation. All these vacant strip malls were like becoming crunched fitness centers and gyms and stuff. Gyms were really kind of the saving grace of these kind of decaying older big spaces and big box stores. And well, now gyms don't really seem like they're going to be flourishing in a COVID world. So funny how that works.
Everyone's, yeah. I mean, I guess a counterpoint to that is that, like, to your point, like, your home is now your office and your gym and all the things, all the above. So you just need that space to be able to expand it, have like some kind of separation. I think people would like to want to leave their home to like a different external place if they could. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. Like you don't necessarily, I don't know, maybe want to go to a fitness center where it's a little more sweaty and custard.
Yeah, I'm really curious about, the future of urbanism, just in the sense of people kind of permanently in their psyche being kind of weird about germs, in the future. Like, what is this impact going to look like, especially on the alpha generation, where they're kind of coming up and they're having their key cognitive development moments in a world where you shouldn't touch people, you have to stay really far away, you have to wear a mask. What is that implication for when they become 20 years old? Are they going to always be, not wanting to be around dense urban areas? Fascinating.
Yeah, I certainly hope not. And this is having, the planning, the industry just think that much more thoughtfully of how do we design density better? How do we design cities better? And it's becoming that much more of an interdisciplinary effort where we have to have, the transportation and the land use and the public health experts come together and think of like, we still can do cities. It's like, there's so much dependent on cities in terms of our footprint on the environment, on greenhouse gas emissions. Like we can't turn our backs on infill development and smart growth. It's just a matter of like, how do we just do so in a better, smarter way?
Yeah. Okay, I got a few good ones here. During 2008, it took at least 2 years for the real estate market to experience the full effects of the crisis. do we expect it to take the same amount of time in the real estate market for this crisis? Longer, shorter? What do we think?
Yeah, I'm not an economist, but my guess is it will take a couple years. Like I mentioned earlier, just anecdotally hearing from our members, like the current pipeline has been very helpful in, I think, stabilizing the economy. And so I do think maybe next year it could be that much more harder once projects dry up. So that could be a big indicator. And then looking historically, as I mentioned, it didn't happen right away after the dot-com bust, but not too long after that, then we saw rents drop even further. So I'm not really sure, but I could guess that we haven't seen the immediate impacts are maybe not as indicative, like maybe the longer term.
Yeah. I know that Zumper's CEO thinks his prediction is we end up with a median apartment price in San Francisco of $3,000 a month. He thinks we'll end up matching Manhattan.
Yeah, I saw that. We'll see. Yeah.
It's so funny. We're like, oh wow, maybe we could reach Manhattan level prices. Like, in what world?
That's something that we're aspiring to. Yeah. And I think we have the outcome that we want, right? Like we wanted lower prices, and that is a benefit for us tenants. I'm a renter too, and so this is something that we've been searching for and wanting for such a long time, but it's not the way that we wanted it. Like we didn't want to have to push out our neighbors and our friends, and we don't want to see our most vulnerable populations, those living paycheck to paycheck, having to leave their homes and, maybe live in the streets because of this. So because, the way to address the housing shortage is to build homes. And that's why, if anything, that's the number one top priority, is do what we can to stimulate more housing development, more housing production.
Yep. Here's an interesting question, and I'll just kind of pull that one out even bigger. A lot of renters in San Francisco are under rent control, and how do we see rent control kind of in the bigger picture, either positively or negatively having an impact with potentially this rent moratorium and all those types of things? And so I kind of, to me, it makes me think that there's a golden handcuffs kind of situation that, people that perhaps really should leave the Bay Area or really want to know that they'll never get that rent control again. Is that kind of holding people on, I wonder?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So again, the Bay Area Council took an opposed position on rent control, just knowing that it is an artificial cap on housing costs and can make that project that much more infeasible to pencil out for housing production. And I think that's all the more true now when we just don't have certainty about rents and like what it is going to mean for underwriting those costs. This could just be another big question mark that developers don't really need to deal with, because I believe it's a 15-year rolling adjustment, this new rent control measure. And so, is that enough time for the developer to refinance or what have you? So I think that does make things that much more, uncertain. We did pass AB 1482, the rent cap bill, which the Bay Area Council did support. And I think that is an opportunity for us to try to protect tenants, because it is really important to help support our most vulnerable populations. And so this is a cap on rents and not necessarily rent control, and it's based on the CPI. So maybe if that's an effort that we could all work together and invest in, that could be the alternative as opposed to rent control.
Okay, here's a really interesting question from Stephen. Cities that rely more heavily on sales tax and TOT, bed taxes, so taxes from like hotels. I think we have 13% is our hotel tax in San Francisco, which every tourist gets like the shock of a lifetime when they finally get their hotel bill. We rely more heavily on that over property tax, where significant sources of their revenue are exposed and at risk in these areas, with, for example, some retail and commercial significantly impacted. Where in the Bay Area would you say are there low-hanging fruit opportunities to perhaps look more flexibly at zoning, not only to address housing issues, but also these types of tax revenue challenges? It's a very thoughtful question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, just looking at, we're actually in the middle of like the Plan Bay Area process, Plan Bay Area 2050, of how we could look at the region growing, more thoughtfully. And, one area that that's come up in discussions is looking more at the Silicon Valley area. Like there is a large amount of land there. So I do see that, like that being more of an opportunity in many different ways moving forward. I mentioned again in San Jose, where over 90% of the land is zoned for single family. So there is, I don't think there's like a lack of necessarily developable land. It's more so of how do we zone in a different way that encourages infill smart development. So.
Yeah, I think a very poignant question, kind of attaching to what you're saying about the zoning practices all around us. I mean, I think it's somewhere like California is 80% single family zoned, like the entire state, and somewhere around 70% in San Francisco. And a lot of people maybe aren't familiar with the fact that really traces back to redlining and really it's exclusionary, and this was very much a conscious choice to separate communities and to keep folks, from being able to, especially the Black community, from being able to buy in traditionally white communities. And with this movement that we're seeing towards racial equity, do you see there being a coalescence between, changing housing and zoning and what that looks like with this social justice movement?
Yes, definitely. It's, going back, and just to be transparent here, I am a resident in Alameda, so I'm especially excited about us overturning this longstanding charter amendment that's banned multifamily. And this has been in the conversations for so long. And finally, I think really because of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's now being taken more seriously than ever. And now it's going to be on the November ballot for us. So I don't know if we would have that same pressure had we been in like the control status. Like this is like a new variable that's having people challenge like land use, and really, like you said, realizing how these are the vestiges of housing segregation, of racism, of keeping people of color out of white neighborhoods. We are definitely, now more than ever, again, going back to Plan Bay Area, we now have this new designation called HRA, High Resources Area. Like, how do we put more affordable housing in communities where there are, the great services, that transportation, access to jobs, better air, better water, and maybe most importantly, better schools. So this is something that is being thoughtful of and talked about more than ever before. And then, that goes back to like some of the legislations we were talking about before and the state level. I'm especially excited about one bill, Senator Wiener's SB 902. His, previous versions, SB 50, the whole thought of like, how do we upzone single family neighborhoods? SB 902 would do so. I forgot how it was phrased, but there was an article where it described SB 902 as like a vitamin that you choose to take. So a city could choose to pass a resolution, and with that resolution, you could upzone your neighborhood when it's near jobs, near transit, up to 10 plexes. So it's not, the bigger SB 50, sexy high density developments near transit, but it's like a really important form of naturally affordable housing, these, missing middle, like, because they've been missing from the development patterns for the past couple of decades, and they're like the middle type of housing. We don't need more of a single family. We do need high density development too, but, because of high construction costs, these higher density developments get passed on to the tenant. So, we're building Ferraris instead of Volvos. So like, how do we build more of the in-between? And so if the city, San Francisco, for example, were to pass, like if SB 902 passes and they say, hey, let's pass this resolution and let's apply this to the west side of San Francisco, then we're going to see more of these missing middle housing where there's already great transportation, great resources, what have you.
Okay. Well, you guys got your homework. Thank you for everybody that's like held on all this time. This is going to be one that you're going to want to watch. I think, again, there's a lot of really interesting pieces of legislation that Xiomara mentioned, and we will be sure to send it out to all of you. Thank you for spending your lunch hour. I look forward to a wildly eventful November. Okay.
Thank you for having me.
I'll talk soon.
Bye.